The afternoon sun rose high over Fairview Estate, searing the summer sky and gilding the immaculate lawns. Centuries-old oak trees framed the grounds, their leaves shimmering like emerald coins in the heat. A warm, persistent breeze carried the tang of freshly cut grass. Across the estate's western lawn spread a series of artful hedges, sculpted into winding shapes that led toward the centerpiece of the property, a large, pristine swimming pool whose turquoise water glistened in the light. Rosalind Fairview, mistress of this sprawling domain, lingered near the pool's edge. She was in her late 50s, slender and elegant, her posture naturally regal. Her silver hair, typically styled in a sleek chignon, now had a few strands escaping in the humidity. She wore a wide-brimmed sun hat that shielded her porcelain complexion from the relentless sun. Despite the sweltering air, she maintained her composure, a half-finished glass of lemonade resting on a small patio table nearby. Her gaze drifted to James, the pool boy. He was in his early 20s, lanky yet muscular. Dressed in a fitted t-shirt and shorts, he moved with effortless coordination, skimming the water to remove leaves. Every motion of his arms caused subtle ripples in the pool, reflections bouncing on its surface. She watched him often, too often, she knew. But there was something in the way he existed in her orbit, his easy warmth contrasting with the cold structure of her life. The hush between them settled, a silence that bristled with unspoken tension. He was aware of her attention. Over the last few weeks, each day he came to the estate, she found excuses to appear by the windows or stroll by the pool. 100 small moments, a shared smile and inquiring glance, had added up to a simmering awareness. Even though an invisible boundary remained between employer and employee, there was a new current in the air. She cleared her throat gently. "James," she said softly, "could you come here for a moment?" He set aside the long pool skimmer. Droplets of chlorinated water clung to his forearms as he drew closer. She noticed his t-shirt was faintly damp from exertion, outlining the lean muscles beneath. He stopped a few feet away, an air of respect about him that her husband, Charles, would have deemed appropriate. Yet, in James's eyes, she caught a flicker of something else. "Yes, Mrs. Fairview?" Removing her hat, she let the sun catch the silver glints in her pinned hair. "I wanted to thank you for your thorough work. The pool has never looked better. If you need any extra supplies or new equipment, do let me know." She tried to keep her tone poised, but her heartbeat thudded in her ears. He offered a small, grateful nod. "Thank you, I'll keep that in mind." A silence settled again. In the distance, a gardener's hedge trimmer whirred to life, sending echoes across the lawn. Rosalind realized she was tracing her fingers along the pool's edge, mirroring James's skimming motion moments earlier. She decided to ask something more personal, if only to keep him near. "What do you do when you're not here, James? Do you have other work or classes?" He glanced down, a touch shy. "I'm taking night courses, mostly general requirements, but I'm leaning toward criminal justice." His gaze lifted, cautious yet proud. "Something about gathering evidence and uncovering the truth has always drawn me in." Her eyes brightened. "Criminal justice, that's impressive. My husband deals in law, though corporate matters rather than criminal. He's forever saying that money can tilt the balance of truth in any courtroom." James gave a rueful grin. "He's probably not wrong, but I believe justice can still be served if someone digs deep enough, exposes the lies." A strange note of conviction crept into his voice. She felt a pang of curiosity and empathy. Here was someone with drive, in stark contrast to her husband's detached ambition. She sipped her lemonade, regaining composure. "It's admirable to have such conviction," she replied, then added, "You could make quite a difference." He seemed momentarily taken aback by her earnest tone. Another breath of silence, then she dismissed him gently, reminding him to drink some lemonade if the heat grew unbearable. He returned to his work, though they exchanged another glance, brimming with unanswered questions. Once she stepped inside the house, Rosalind found herself roaming its grand corridors without destination. The estate's interior, with shining tiled floors and crystal chandeliers, felt increasingly empty. Her husband, Charles Fairview, a prominent corporate lawyer nearing his mid-60s, spent most of his days away, traveling for high-profile mergers and acquisitions. That left her drifting through echoing halls with only the staff for company. And most recently, James's presence had become more than an idle distraction. Eventually, she retreated to her private sitting room, a cozy chamber with tall windows that overlooked the pool. She edged the curtains and watched James finish clearing debris. Muscles flexed in his arms each time he reached across the water. The intangible pull she felt toward him baffled her. She was a woman nearing 60, wealthy and firmly placed in society. How could she be so enthralled by a college-age worker? Yet desire coursed through her. It was more than mere attraction. James had a sincerity that Charles lacked. Her phone buzzed on a nearby table. Charles's name appeared in a text message. Flying to Seattle at 7 a.m. Need the final documents from the safe. Also confirm dinner with the Rutherfords next week. She read the message twice. Bland, transactional, typical of him. No personal greeting or inquiry about her day. With a brief sigh, she tapped out a reply. Documents ready. Safe travels. As she set the phone aside, her mind drifted again to James. He was finishing his tasks, collecting his tools. She thought of the next morning when Charles would leave for several days. A tremor of excitement ran through her at the notion of having James near the estate without her husband's looming shadow. She could let her guard down, indulge the stirring in her chest. She watched James walk around the side of the house, presumably toward his truck. Tomorrow, she murmured. I'll see him tomorrow, and maybe... The thought remained unfinished, but anticipation lit her eyes. In that shimmering afternoon sun, a decision coalesced. She wanted more than fleeting glances. No matter how improper or risky, she yearned for a genuine spark of closeness. With Charles gone, there would be space for private moments. The moral implications pricked her conscience, but she brushed them aside. Loneliness had weighed on her for years, and this might be her chance to feel alive again. That night, Rosalind joined Charles for dinner in the vast dining hall. The table felt too large for two people. Rows of polished silverware flanked each porcelain plate. She had arranged a meal of roasted salmon, asparagus, and lemon garlic rice, with a crisp white wine to pair. Yet the flavor seemed muted in the hush that settled between them. She finally broke the silence, summoning a polite tone. You'll be gone 3 days, correct? Or is it longer? He dabbed his mouth with a napkin. 3 or 4, depending on how negotiations go. There's a merger on the verge of final approval, but the shareholders want more assurances. His words washed over her. Once she might have taken pride in his drive and success. Now it felt like a foreign world. Well, she said, I'll prepare your usual travel bag, including those dietary supplements your doctor recommended. He speared a piece of salmon. Fine, just make sure the documents from the safe are on my desk in the morning. The Rutherfords can wait for dinner. They keep postponing anyway. She nodded, her throat tightening at how perfunctory this exchange felt. Understood, she replied softly. He studied her for a moment, his gaze almost clinical. You haven't come on a single trip in months. Not interested in seeing Seattle again? She set down her fork with a soft clink. Your schedule in Seattle is mostly business dinners. I doubt there'd be much for me to do. He shrugged. Fair enough. At least you aren't bored here. She forced a small smile. I keep busy. In truth, boredom and loneliness shadowed her daily life. But explaining that to Charles was pointless. They concluded dinner with little more discussion. Afterward, Charles disappeared into his study to review papers. Rosalind sipped the last of her wine, tension coiled in her chest. She thought of their early years of marriage, remembering the passion that once flickered between them. How easily it had faded into routine and polite tolerance. Now, they might as well be distant acquaintances performing social niceties. Glancing at the clock, she stood from the table and ventured into the study. Dark wood shelves brimmed with heavy tomes on corporate law. A single brass lamp cast a glow on the desk's polished surface. Charles stared at a stack of contracts, his fingers drumming impatiently. Is everything in order for your flight? She asked. He frowned, flipping a page. Yes, I have a car picking me up at 5:30. We'll get to the airport well before 7. A faint wave of sadness washed over her. Safe travels, she offered. He nodded without lifting his gaze. Yes, yes. Moments later, she retreated upstairs. After slipping into a silk nightgown, she studied her reflection in the tall mirror opposite the bed. Silver hair, faint lines near her eyes and mouth, an elegant figure still capable of turning heads. There was a time she had felt confident and content by Charles's side. but life had become mechanical, colorless. She crawled under the covers, turning off the bedside lamp. Sleep wouldn't come, so her thoughts roamed free. Instinctively, she pictured James's young face, those earnest eyes that shone with curiosity and quiet ambition. She recalled his shy smile when she offered him lemonade. Her pulse fluttered at the memory. Guilt flickered. She was a married woman, though married no longer carried the warmth of devotion. Was it truly so awful to crave a spark she'd long been denied? Finally, she drifted into fitful dreams of water shimmering under moonlight, her nightgown billowing as she stepped into the pool. In the murky reflection, she saw James reaching for her, a soft, insistent warmth in his touch. She woke with a start, heart racing. The clock on the nightstand showed 2:30. She lay awake until dawn, anxious for Charles to leave, for a day that might reshape everything. Rosalind rose early, showering and dressing in tailored trousers and a silky blouse, her hair pinned neatly. By the time she descended to the foyer, Charles was already pacing, phone in hand. His suitcase waited by the door. "Your documents," she said, handing him a leather folder, "all signed." He accepted it with a curt nod. "Thank you." He glanced at her, then gave a perfunctory kiss on her cheek that felt more like a formality than an affectionate gesture. A horn sounded outside. "I'll call tonight," he muttered, scooping up his briefcase. Then he was gone, the heavy wooden door shutting behind him with a faint echo. Rosalind inhaled slowly, letting her shoulders relax. The large house felt different, lighter. She proceeded to the kitchen, brewed fresh coffee, and stepped onto the back patio to watch the sunrise. Pinks and oranges glowed over the orchard. She sipped her drink, the warmth soothing her nerves. She repeated silently, "He's gone. I can breathe." At 7, she heard the distant rumble of an engine. Peering toward the driveway, she saw James's pickup truck. He parked and hopped out, toolbox in hand, wearing jeans and a snug t-shirt. Rosalind placed her coffee cup on a small patio table and walked to greet him. "Morning, Mrs. Fairview," he said politely. She smiled. "Good morning. But please, while Charles is away, it's just Rosalind." A hint of color touched her cheeks as she said it, stepping aside so he could pass into the back garden. He hesitated before repeating, "Rosalind," as if tasting the name. Something in his voice sent a pleasant shiver through her. She gestured toward the pool. "I was hoping you could do a thorough check today. I'd like to swim this afternoon if it's not too chilly." He set down the toolbox, nodding. "Certainly. I'll start with the chemical levels." She watched him walk to the pool, her heart pounding in a way that felt both thrilling and absurd. She busied herself on the patio, tidying a small arrangement of potted flowers, but her attention remained fixed on James. Every so often, he glanced in her direction, as though ensuring she was still there. When he finished testing, he scribbled notes on a clipboard and approached her. "The chlorine's slightly elevated. I'll add a neutralizer, and it'll be perfect for swimming in a few hours." "Wonderful," she replied, voice calm. Then, quieter, "I wanted to show you something inside. Some books on criminal law I found. You might find them useful." A curious gleam lit his eyes. "I'd love to see them, if you have time." Inside, the house was hushed, with the staff mostly preoccupied in separate wings or enjoying a scheduled day off. Rosalind led James down the main hallway toward a cozy library whose walls were lined with walnut shelves. A plush rug covered much of the floor, and sunlight streamed through tall windows. She pointed out a row of legal reference works. "My husband used to dabble in different specialties, so we have an odd assortment." James scanned the spines: forensic pathology, courtroom strategy, evidence, and motive. He ran a finger over the leather-bound volumes, looking impressed. "I never expected such a collection here." She smiled, standing near enough to sense his warmth. "Charles liked to collect, though I doubt he's looked at these in years." He carefully pulled out a thick treatise on forensic procedures, skimming the introduction. "This is fascinating," he murmured. "The steps investigators use to piece together crimes, it's what draws me to the field." Rosalind tilted her head. "What aspect intrigues you most?" He glanced up, a faint flush coloring his cheeks at her closeness. "How truth can hide behind so many layers of lies, how you have to be meticulous with evidence, interviews, everything, to ensure the innocent go free and the guilty are caught. But there's also so much corruption." She studied him, noticing the earnestness in his expression. "You speak with conviction." I admire that. The world needs more people who care about true justice. He licked his lips as if uncertain whether to respond. Then softly, sometimes to reveal a truth, you have to be willing to break boundaries. I just hope I'm brave enough when the time comes. She felt her breath snag. The room felt suddenly smaller, the hush thick with unsaid words. She realized how close they stood. She searched his gaze, drawn by an inexplicable magnetism, until the shrill ring of the house phone in the hallway shattered the moment. She forced a half laugh. "I'll get that," she whispered, stepping out to answer. Charles's clipped voice reached her ears from Seattle, confirming a meeting. She handled his question with perfunctory politeness, heart pounding from the near-intimate moment she'd left behind. By the time she hung up and returned to the library, James had taken a half step back. Though his cheeks were faintly pink, the tension in his stance told her he felt the same gravitational pull. She joined him near the shelves, wanting to recapture the closeness, but another wave of shyness kept them apart. Finally, she cleared her throat. "You should probably finish your pool maintenance. I don't want to keep you from your work." His expression showed a tinge of disappointment. "Of course. I'll be back tomorrow if that's all right." She nodded, swallowing. "Yes, tomorrow." "Please," she almost said aloud, though she managed to keep it unspoken. Rosalind followed him to the back door, her pulse fluttering. As he walked across the patio, he turned back once, offering a small, hesitant smile. She gazed after him, thoughts swirling. They had come close, so close, to a line that once seemed impossible to cross. Yet even as she trembled at the risk, a deep thrill filled her. He would return, and perhaps next time they wouldn't hold back. Rosalind spent the following morning in restless anticipation. She woke early, discarding one outfit after another. Eventually, she chose a pale sundress that skimmed her figure, accentuating her waist without appearing too obvious. She wore minimal makeup, only enough to highlight her bright eyes and smooth complexion. As she inspected her reflection, her heart fluttered like a young girl expecting a suitor. An absurd feeling for a woman nearing 60, but she welcomed the sense of being alive. At mid-morning, James's truck pulled in. Instead of going straight to the pool, he approached the main entrance. She answered the door before he could knock, stepping aside so he could enter the air-conditioned foyer. "Good morning," she said. Her voice sounded steady, though her heart hammered. "Morning, Rosalind." He set his toolbox gently near the wall. "I hope you're well." She nodded. "Yes, it's quiet without Charles. I wanted to show you something upstairs. We have a rooftop terrace you might find interesting." His brows arched in curiosity. "I didn't realize there was a terrace." She led him up the grand curving staircase lined with portraits of Fairview ancestors. Plush carpeting absorbed their footsteps, lending an intimate hush to the hallway. At the end, a narrow door opened onto steep steps that led to a hidden terrace. Wrought iron railings surrounded a cozy area with a small table and chairs, potted plants, and a sweeping view of the estate. The orchard stretched to the west, the pool glinting below. He sucked in a breath. "This is beautiful." She stepped up beside him, resting a hand on the iron rail. "I used to come here to read when I wanted privacy. Charles never comes up. He hates heights." She felt the breeze catch the hem of her sundress, lifting it slightly against her thighs. He scanned the view, then turned to her, something tender in his eyes. "Thank you for showing me." A pause. "I don't always feel I belong in places like this." "You belong," she said quietly, reaching out to touch his arm. "I wanted to share it with you." His gaze locked with hers, an unspoken question passing between them. Slowly, he moved closer. When he dipped his head, brushing his lips across hers, Rosalind felt a radiant surge of warmth. The kiss was tentative, a gentle testing of boundaries. She responded, hands sliding over his shoulders, pulling him closer. In that moment, the hush of the orchard below and the distant hum of a lawnmower melted into the background. She tasted lemonade and the faint salt of his skin. They broke apart, breath unsteady. James's fingers trailed along her jaw. "Rosalind, I don't want to cause trouble," he whispered. She pressed her forehead to his. "I've had trouble for years, James. You're the first bright spot in a long time." Another kiss followed, hungrier this time. She leaned against the rail, letting him hold her firmly. A soft moan escaped her throat, surprising her with its intensity. Time seemed to slow, their surroundings bathed in the midday sun, Finally, they pulled back, flushed and panting. She exhaled, laughter trembling in her voice. "Let's go inside. It's too exposed out here." He nodded, swallowing hard. They carefully retraced their steps through the corridor, glancing around for any staff. Seeing no one, Rosalind guided him into her bedroom. Sunlit drapes cast shifting patterns on the carpet. She shut the door, leaning against it with nerves ablaze. He stood awkwardly by the bed, as though unsure if he was truly allowed inside this sanctum. She approached, taking his hand. "We're alone," she whispered. "You can stay if you want." His answer came in the form of a deep, urgent kiss, arms encircling her waist. In halting motions, they shed the boundaries of clothing, each piece slipping away. She felt shy, yet liberated, a swirl of self-consciousness and fierce longing. On the canopy bed's crisp linens, they discovered each other with reverent slowness, his hands on her waist, her fingers combing through his hair. Every gentle caress lit sparks across her skin. They took their time, breathing in each other's warmth. Sunlight played across their bodies, revealing the lines of age and youth in tender contrast. Far from being a deterrent, those contrasts felt natural and deeply sensual, a merging of stories, regrets, and hope. When they finally stilled, she rested her head on his chest, the rhythmic thud of his heart calming her. He stroked her silver hair in silence. Neither spoke for a while, words feeling unnecessary. She let the hush cradle them, reveling in a peace she had nearly forgotten existed. Eventually, he murmured, "Rosalind, where do we go from here?" She closed her eyes, torn between euphoria and reality. "I don't know," she admitted, "but I don't want to hide this forever. My marriage is all but dead. Yet Charles—" Her voice trailed off. His hold on her tightened. "We'll figure it out," he said simply, though she sensed the worry in his tone. The hush enveloped them, no immediate solution revealing itself. For now, she chose to bask in the stolen moment, one that had taken her years of loneliness to finally claim. In the next 2 days, Charles still away, Rosalind and James lived in a bubble of clandestine bliss. He came to service the pool, but after a quick check of pH levels, he'd slip inside to meet her in the library or up on the terrace. Their whispered conversations, stolen touches, and shared laughter created an intimacy Rosalind had never known with Charles. Sometimes she led him to her bedroom, the late afternoon sun painting them in gold. Other times they found themselves pressed against a corridor wall, exchanging rushed kisses before footsteps approached. Their sense of impropriety fueled the passion. She, the estate's mistress, and he, the young man who'd once been invisible in her daily routine. Yet as their connection deepened, Rosalind felt uneasy. She pictured Charles returning, prowling the halls. Though no love remained between them, he was a controlling man. If he discovered her infidelity, she feared his retaliation. Charles had the power to freeze her accounts, cut off her social standing, and tarnish her name. Or worse, he could harm James, who had no fortune or status to protect him. Late one afternoon, she and James lounged on her bed, the sheets rumpled around their legs. She trailed her fingers through his hair, her mind darkened by worry. He noticed her pensiveness. "You're thinking of Charles, aren't you?" he asked softly, lips brushing her shoulder. She sighed. "Yes, he'll be home tomorrow. I'm terrified of what might happen if he catches on." She paused, swallowing. "He's a powerful lawyer, James. He can ruin people's lives with a single phone call." He propped himself on an elbow. "So we'll be careful," he murmured. "But you shouldn't live in fear." Her brow furrowed. "That's the problem. I have been living in fear, or maybe just in quiet resignation for too long. But if we keep this affair secret and it comes out, he'll use every resource to ensure we pay." James's expression shifted. "Then maybe we need a plan that forces him to let go." "Let go?" He hesitated. "If Charles is compromised, he can't fight you in court. Or at least, he'd have bigger problems than controlling you." Her eyes narrowed. "What are you suggesting?" A slow breath. "You mentioned he deals in shady mergers, questionable business deals. If there's something illegal, you could expose it, or pin a crime on him." Rosalind's heart pounded. "Pinning a crime? That's extreme." He took her hand. "So is letting him control the rest of your life. I'd do anything to protect you, and if it takes outmaneuvering him at his own game..." He trailed off, searching her gaze for any spark of agreement. She swallowed, mixed emotions roiling. Part of her bristled at the immorality of framing her husband. Another part whispered that Charles's manipulations might someday destroy James, and her too. After all, Charles had built a career crushing adversaries. "I need time to think," she whispered. He nodded, gently brushing hair from her face. "I won't push you." That night, she slept fitfully. Charles would return the following afternoon, re-establishing his cold reign over the estate. Rosalind knew she had to maintain composure, keep James at arm's length in public. Her chest ached at the thought. In her restless dreams, she saw flickers of forging papers, writing her husband's signature on documents that would condemn him. She woke drenched in sweat, unsure whether it was guilt or liberation that pounded in her veins. Charles arrived late the next day, his face set in a stern mask of exhaustion. He barked instructions to the staff, dropped his suitcase in the foyer, and demanded a scotch from the bar. Rosalind stayed silent, monitoring his mood. Over dinner, he barely touched his food, muttering about a fiasco in one of his recent deals. That night, she heard him pacing in his study, speaking into the phone in clipped tones. Phrases like, "Fix it," and "We cannot afford this scandal," drifted to her ears. Intrigued, she hovered by the doorway. He complained of a newly merged firm that had skeletons in the closet, hinting at bribery or something equally damning. "If these files get out, it'll sink us," he hissed. Then he lowered his voice, forcing her to strain to catch details. When he ended the call, he noticed her near the door. "Need something?" he snapped. She smiled demurely. "I just heard raised voices. Is everything all right?" He sighed, massaging his temples. "Business. Uncooperative partners, don't concern yourself." She retreated, but her heart raced. If there were unethical dealings, might that be the key James had mentioned? A real scandal that Charles might bury, one they could exploit or enlarge into something lethal to his reputation. The next morning, Charles left early for a meeting. Rosalind summoned James to a lesser-used lounge near the kitchen, away from staff. She relayed what she'd overheard. "It's some shady file," she whispered, "something that could ruin him if exposed. He's desperate." James's eyes gleamed. "Then that's our path. If we can access it, we can spin a bigger crime out of it, maybe a murder or something more severe, enough to keep him off balance." She clutched the back of a chair, knuckles white. "Are we truly talking about framing him for murder?" His face turned serious. "If we do that, we need real evidence or something that looks real enough to fool investigators. I'm not saying we kill anyone, but if the file suggests a death was covered up, we can make it look like Charles orchestrated it." Rosalind swallowed. "You realize if we fail, he'll destroy us." "Yes," James said quietly, stepping closer. "But if we succeed, you're free." He brushed a hand along her arm. "I can't stand by while he traps you in a loveless marriage, and if he found out about us, he'd punish me." She closed her eyes, exhaling. "Let's see what we can find." Carefully. That night, James arrived under the ruse of adjusting pool chemicals. At 11, Rosalind let him in, her pulse racing. They crept through dim corridors to Charles's study, finding the door unlocked. She spun the safe's dial with shaking fingers, retrieving a folder on the merged firm. James scanned its pages, eyes gleaming. It referenced Hush Money and Brian Kessler, an accountant who died in a suspicious crash. "If we forge documents, we can make it look like Charles ordered a hit," he whispered. A car engine rumbled outside. Rosalind froze. "He's home?" They ducked into a side hall as Charles entered, sighing as he dropped his keys. His footsteps eventually faded upstairs. James squeezed her hand. "We have what we need." He slipped away, leaving Rosalind breathless. Had it truly come to this? Stealing evidence to fabricate a murder? Yet, as she steadied herself, one thought remained: there's no other way out. For the next week, Rosalind and James barely saw each other in person, fearful of arousing suspicion. Instead, they communicated by brief texts or coded notes. "Everything's in place. Documents ready." James revealed he had scanned the key pages from the folder, working at home to craft additional evidence. He explained the steps via messages, referencing software to create authentic email exchanges, bank transfers, and phone logs that would frame Charles for orchestrating the accountant's death. Rosalind's chest clenched whenever she imagined the scope of the deception. She had never engaged in anything so perilous. Yet every night, Charles's cold dismissal reminded her there was no safe path. If he discovered the affair, James would be blacklisted, or worse, and she might lose everything. She swallowed her moral qualms, forging ahead. James managed to secure an encrypted email account from which they would leak the fabricated documents to a local investigative journalist known for uncovering corporate corruption. They planned to reference the real hush money to give the forgeries credibility. If the press latched on, Charles would be hammered by scandal. One humid afternoon, James arrived to clean the pool filter. Once inside, he found Rosalind in the study. They locked the door behind them. He showed her a flash drive. "These files," he said, tapping it, "link Charles to an alleged accident that was actually premeditated murder. We highlight that the accountant threatened to expose the merged firm's crimes, so Charles quietly arranged his disposal. None of this will hold up if top forensic analysts dig deep, but the public outcry alone might sink him before he can mount a defense." She took a shaky breath, scanning the forged email transcripts on his laptop. They bore timestamps from years prior, referencing bribes, veiled threats, instructions to neutralize the potential whistleblower. It looked terrifyingly real. "He'll deny it vehemently," she murmured. James's expression hardened. "Yes, but the burden will be on him to prove it's fake. Meanwhile, we get the narrative out first." He glanced at her uncertainly. "Are we sure about this?" She closed her eyes, remembering Charles's chilly manner, his talk of disposing liabilities, his power to crush them. "Yes," she whispered, "we have no choice." They sealed the plan that evening. James used a burner laptop at a nearby cafe with public Wi-Fi to send the documents to the journalist. The message read, "This is the truth behind the whistleblower's death at Fairview's firm. We can't stay silent anymore." They wore inconspicuous clothing, avoided cameras, and paid in cash for their coffee, leaving no digital footprint. When the deed was done, Rosalind felt both dread and a flicker of exhilaration. "He'll be so furious," she thought. "He might suspect me, but if we've done this cleanly, he can't prove a thing." Within days, sensational headlines surfaced. Corporate lawyer Charles Fairview implicated in murder cover-up. The story described an accountant's suspicious death, alleged hush money, and newly leaked files pointing to Charles as mastermind. The local media devoured it, quoting the forged emails. Outraged voices filled radio shows and blogs, accusing him of being a heartless killer with no regard for justice. Charles reeled. He spent hours calling his legal team, shouting that everything was fabricated. He threatened lawsuits, demanded retractions, but public sentiment was already souring. Clients withdrew from his law firm. Business partners distanced themselves. Investigative journalists clamored for interviews. The district attorney announced a preliminary review to see if they should open a formal investigation. Rosalind watched him pace the estate, phone pressed to his ear, tie loosened, hair disheveled. She feigned surprise, inquiring politely if there was anything she could do. He shot her a glare. "It's a smear campaign. Someone close must have stolen or falsified documents. I'll find them." When he left for another urgent meeting, Rosalind exhaled, heart pounding. She summoned James to a quiet corner of the garden. He arrived looking composed, though tension lingered in his eyes. "It's working," she whispered. "The story's all over the news. He's panicking." James nodded. "He's a big name, so it's a scandal. If the DA finds enough to open a criminal case, we'll see him indicted." She shivered, hugging herself. "I never imagined I'd stoop so low. I feel awful sometimes." He pulled her into a gentle embrace. "I know. But think of what he'd do if he discovered our affair. This is self-defense, Rosalind." He cradled her cheek in his hand. "We'll soon be free." They stayed locked in that embrace, the rustle of leaves and distant engine noises enveloping them. She closed her eyes, absorbing the comfort of his closeness, telling herself it was worth the moral cost. As days turned into a week, the accusations intensified. The press uncovered more about Charles's firm, how hush money had indeed been paid to quiet certain investigations. The real facts meshed seamlessly with their forged storyline. One evening, Charles slammed through the front door, raving about forensic analysts he'd hired to prove the documents were doctored. Yet every attempt to discredit the leak turned up more questions. The public smelled blood. That night, Rosalind found him in the living room, slumped in an armchair, staring at nothing. She approached tentatively. "Charles?" she said softly. He looked up, eyes hollow. "Do you believe I'm a murderer?" She swallowed. "I of course not," she lied, brow creasing with feigned concern. He gave a humorless laugh. I might be ruthless, but not this. Still, no one will believe me. For a moment, pity surged in her chest. She recalled the man she'd once admired for his sharp mind and unwavering focus. Now, undone by a scheme she and her lover had orchestrated, she almost reached out to comfort him. But fear stopped her. He glared at her as if sensing her hesitation. "I'll find who's behind this," he repeated darkly. "They won't get away with it." He stormed away, leaving her trembling. The next morning, multiple investigators from the DA's office arrived with official questions. Charles's legal world was collapsing around him. Meetings at his firm devolved into chaotic arguments. Some partners demanded he step back to avoid further damage. Clients canceled contracts, unsettled by the swirling scandal. Rosalind frequently glimpsed him hunched over his desk at night, head in his hands. A quiet war raged in her mind. Was this justice for his years of neglect? Or had she become a monster forging evidence to crush him? She confided her turmoil to James in the orchard behind the estate. A row of blossoming apple trees cast dappled shadows on the grass. "I can't help feeling guilty," she confessed, her eyes misty. "We're condemning him to a fate he might not deserve." James's arms encircled her waist. "He'd do worse to us. If you tried to divorce him, you'd lose everything, maybe even your reputation. He'd smear you, claim you were incompetent or worse. This is the only way we walk away unscathed." She clung to him, nodding. The orchard's floral scent mingled with her swirling emotions. She lifted her face to his, seeking reassurance in a kiss. He obliged, pressing his lips to hers with a soft desperation. They leaned against the trunk of a blossoming tree, ignoring the pollen drifting around them. In that stolen moment, their conspiracy felt justified. Two lovers forging a path to freedom, refusing to be caged. Soon, a formal investigation began. The DA's office declared they had credible evidence Charles Fairview had orchestrated a whistleblower's death years before. Charles raged, calling it slander, but law enforcement delivered subpoenas. Rosalind watched from the staircase as men in suits arrived at the estate, presenting official papers. Charles cursed and slammed a door. She heard him vow, "I'll see them all in court. I'll prove it's fake." She locked herself in her bedroom, heart hammering. The plan was unfolding exactly as she and James intended. Yet the cost weighed on her. She tried to calm her thoughts by focusing on how close she was to deliverance from a dead marriage. That evening, after the investigators left, Charles confronted her outside the library. "You seem oddly calm," he said, suspicion lacing his words. She stiffened. "I'm just trying not to add to the chaos." An idea came to her. She feigned a trembling voice. "This is frightening. I don't understand these horrible accusations. I never imagined." She trailed off, letting tears brim in her eyes. It worked. Charles backed off, perhaps embarrassed. "Right," he muttered. "I'm sorry. You're not to blame." He tapped his phone angrily. "But I will find who is." She nodded, letting tears spill for effect. Inside, she quaked with relief, grateful her deception held. Later that night, James slipped onto the property again for a late rendezvous. They met under the orchard's moonlit canopy, the scent of night-blooming jasmine drifting around them. "It's only a matter of time before they arrest him," James murmured. "The DA is under public pressure. Once he's indicted, there's no quick exit for him. He'll be too busy saving his own neck to bother you." She pressed her face to his chest. "I never thought I'd wish prison on anyone. But here I am." He kissed the top of her head. "We can't turn back. Once he's indicted, you can file for divorce. Cite irreconcilable differences. Public sympathy might even be on your side." She looked up at him, tears glistening. "You'll stay with me, after this storm passes?" His expression softened. "If that's what you want, I'll never leave." They shared a fervent kiss in the hush of the orchard. A sliver of moon illuminated their entwined silhouettes, a tender contrast to the darkness of their plan. She told herself it was worth the price, that real happiness awaited them. A few days later, the final blow fell. Police cars and unmarked vehicles swarmed the estate at dawn. Charles, bleary-eyed, met them at the foyer. Investigators presented a warrant, and he was handcuffed in front of stunned staff. Rosalind stood at the top of the stairs, feigning shock. Flashes from reporters' cameras lit the driveway. Journalists shouted questions. Charles glared at her once, a flash of betrayal crossing his face. Then he was led away, swarmed by microphones. The hush left behind felt surreal. Staff whispered among themselves. The phone rang incessantly with calls from lawyers and acquaintances. Rosalind answered none, retreating to her bedroom. When the immediate chaos settled, she stared out the window, trembling, unable to decide if she felt liberated or horrified. With Charles in custody, the district attorney's office pressed charges: conspiracy to commit murder, covering up evidence, financial fraud. The media churned out updates daily. Charles's lawyers filed motions insisting the emails and transfers were forged, but the authorities found them convincing enough to move forward. Public opinion, already soured by his corporate reputation, weighed heavily against him. Rosalind visited him once in jail, more out of closure than concern. She stood before a plexiglass divider, picking up the telephone receiver. He looked disheveled, eyes bloodshot. "Why are you here?" he snarled. "To gloat?" She swallowed. "No, I wanted to see if I'm all right." He gave a bitter laugh, pressing his free hand to the glass. "I'm not. And when I prove these documents are fake, I'll come after whoever did this." His gaze bore into her, as though suspecting her involvement but lacking proof. She lowered her eyes. "I'm sorry," was all she could manage. He slammed the receiver down, turning his back. A guard escorted her out. She emerged onto the street, heart pounding. James waited at a coffee shop nearby, and she rushed into his arms. He drove her back to the estate in silence. Over the next few weeks, Charles remained in jail awaiting trial, his bail set astronomically high. The scandal decimated his firm. Partners cut ties, wanting no association with a suspected murderer. Rosalind quietly filed for divorce, citing irreparable damage. The press briefly hounded her, eager for a statement, but she portrayed herself as the distraught wife of a potentially dangerous man. Sympathy from neighbors trickled her way, enough to keep scrutiny off her role. James continued working at the estate for a short while longer, though fewer staff remained. He and Rosalind stole gentle embraces in neglected corners, no longer worried about Charles catching them. When she felt pangs of guilt, James reminded her that Charles had used fear and manipulation for years, and that if they'd done nothing, the situation would have been far worse. Finally, the day came when Charles stood trial. The prosecution presented an avalanche of digital records, emails, bank statements, phone logs, meticulously forged by James. Despite Charles's protest, the authenticity appeared unassailable. Combined with legitimate evidence of past unethical practices, the jury found him guilty on multiple counts. He was sentenced to a lengthy prison term, raging at the verdict. Cameras captured his final meltdown as he was taken away in cuffs, still declaring the evidence a sham. For Rosalind, the rest unraveled swiftly. She sold the estate, dividing it into parcels after her divorce was finalized. She told the few remaining staff to seek new positions, paid them generous severance. Then, with James by her side, she quietly vanished from the social sphere. Rumors flew. Some said she fled the country to escape shame. Others claimed she retired to a quiet coastal town with a secret lover. In a modest house by the sea, Rosalind and James built a quiet life, free from the ruins of Fairview Estate. He found local work while she lived on the remnants of her assets, untouched by Charles's downfall. Some nights, guilt gripped her, but James would take her hand, whispering, "We did what we had to." Their love, once forbidden, now flourished, but under the shadow of a shared secret. They had forged documents, sealing Charles's fate, and though Rosalind never voiced her doubts, she told herself it was necessary. Over time, the scandal faded, leaving Charles to proclaim his innocence from prison, while the world moved on. On quiet afternoons, James studied old casebooks, and Rosalind would recall the moment their longing began. The waves outside lulled her at night, a softer hush than guilt. Though built on deceit, their freedom felt real. Holding on to each other, they let the tide pull them forward, never looking back.